She did the arithmetic every morning before the children woke, not on paper, not with numbers written in a column. In her head, the way she did everything, silently, quickly, with the specific efficiency of a woman who had learned that the margin between her family's survival and its collapse was measured in fractions of a penny, and that the fractions changed every day, and that getting the arithmetic wrong on any given morning could mean that by evening, something she could not replace would be gone. 100 weight of coal cost 9 pence in the winter of 1878. A loaf of bread cost 3 pence halfpenny. A pint of milk, if you could get milk that was actually milk, and not milk that had been stretched with water and whitened with chalk until it resembled the thing it was supposed to be, without providing any of the nutrition the thing it was supposed to be contained, cost 2 pence. Her husband, when he was working, brought home between 15 and 20 shillings a week. When he was not working, which in winter happened with the regularity of a season that had no interest in his family's need for his wages, he brought home nothing, and the arithmetic that had been difficult became impossible, and impossible was not a theoretical condition. It was a Tuesday morning in January, with 3 children under 6, and a baby who had been coughing since Sunday, and a grate that was cold because the coal was gone, and the money for more coal was also gone. And the question she was calculating was not whether she could afford to heat the room, but which of the things she could not afford was going to kill her children first. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what a poor Victorian mother did to keep her baby alive through a London winter. What she fed it, what she wrapped it in, what she gave it when it would not stop crying, what she could not afford, what she could not prevent, and what happened in the houses where the arithmetic finally ran out. This is Dreadful History Files, and this is the story of the women who fought the cold with nothing and loved their children with everything, and lost them to a system that had calculated the cost of their survival and decided it was not worth paying. The first calculation was heat. Coal was the only source of warmth in a working-class tenement in the 1870s and 1880s, and coal cost money, and money in the quantities required to heat even a single room through a British winter was money that a family earning 15 shillings a week did not have in surplus. The Registrar General's reports from the period document what happened when the calculation went wrong. The death rate in London's poorest districts rose every winter with a predictability that the public health authorities noted and the political establishment did not address with any urgency, commensurate with the scale of what was happening. In some East End parishes, the death rate reached 50 per thousand, more than double the national average, and the excess was concentrated among the very young and the very old, the people whose bodies were least able to sustain themselves when the environment stopped sustaining them. A one-room tenement in Whitechapel or Bethnal Green in January was a space approximately 12 feet by 10, shared by a family of 5 or 6, heated by a single fireplace that consumed coal at a rate the family could not maintain. The walls were thin enough to transmit the neighbor's cough. The window was single-glazed and sealed against the cold with rags stuffed into the gaps between the frame and the wall, which reduced the draft without eliminating it and prevented the ventilation that the room desperately needed without providing the insulation the room desperately lacked. The ceiling was low. The air inside was the air that the fire had consumed, and the bodies had exhaled, and the damp had saturated, and when the fire went out because the coal was finished, the temperature inside the room began its descent toward the temperature outside, which in a London January could sit at or below freezing for days. The baby slept in whatever the family had. A wooden box lined with rags, a drawer pulled from a chest and set beside the bed, a space in the bed itself, between the parents, which was warmer than any alternative, and which carried the risk that the coroner's records documented with quiet regularity, under the heading accidental overlaying, meaning an infant found dead in a shared bed, recorded as having been smothered in the night. The Registrar General noted the statistical frequency of these deaths in certain parishes. The Lancet observed that the rates were impossible to explain as pure accident. Nobody used a clearer word for what was happening in some of those cases, because using a clearer word would have required the system to look at what its own economics were producing, and that was a confrontation the century preferred to avoid. She wrapped the baby in everything she had, shawls, rags, her own coat, if the cold was severe enough that the baby's survival required it, and her own discomfort was a price she was willing to pay, which it always was, because the arithmetic of motherhood does not include the mother's comfort as a variable. The baby was layered until the layers were all she possessed, and if the layers were still not enough, which on the worst nights they were not, she held the baby against her own body and used her warmth as the last available fuel, because her body was the one resource the economic system had not been able to take from her, and she spent it without calculation, because some calculations a mother refuses to make. If you are watching Dreadful History Files for the first time, subscribe now, because what follows is the part of this story that the public health reports documented in numbers and that nobody documented in human terms, and it has been waiting a very long time to be told, as though the women at its center were people rather than statistics. The second calculation was food. Breastfeeding was free, which made it the only thing in the infant's life that was, and for a mother who could stay home with her baby, breast milk was the single most important resource she possessed. It was warm, it was nutritious, it was available without cost, and without the contamination that every commercially available alternative carried. It was also available only as long as the mother was present, which meant that it was available only as long as the mother was not working, which meant that it was available only as long as the family could survive on the father's income alone, which in the winter months, when casual labor contracted and the weather stopped the outdoor work that many laborers depended on, was frequently not possible. The calculation was precise. If she went to work, the baby could not breastfeed. If the baby could not breastfeed, it had to be fed something else. The something else was pap, a mixture of bread soaked in water, sometimes with a little sugar added, sometimes with beer or gin mixed in to quiet the baby and help it sleep. Pap provided almost no nutrition. It was a filler, a way to occupy the baby's stomach and stop the crying, and it was fed to infants through a device called a pap boat, a small spouted vessel that allowed the liquid to be poured into the baby's mouth by whoever was minding the child while the mother was at work. The person minding the child was not a professional. She was a neighbor, an older child, a grandmother if one was available, or nobody at all if nobody was available, which in the crowded tenements of the East End was more common than the official record acknowledged because the official record had no mechanism for counting the babies who were left alone. The mother left for work at 6 or 7 in the morning. The baby was left with whoever was there. The pap was prepared. The fire was tended if there was coal. The mother returned 12 or 14 hours later to whatever she found. What she sometimes found was a baby who had been fed pap mixed with Godfrey's cordial. Godfrey's cordial was a patent medicine containing opium dissolved in a sweet syrup, sold openly in every chemist's shop in England, marketed to mothers and nurses as a remedy for infant restlessness, teething pain, colic, and the general category of infant distress that the product's manufacturers had identified as a market opportunity, and the product's ingredients addressed by rendering the infant unconscious. The opium in Godfrey's cordial was sufficient, in doses that were easy to miscalculate and that the product's label did not clearly specify, to kill an infant. The Registrar General's reports and the medical literature of the period document infant deaths from opium poisoning with a frequency that constitutes an epidemic conducted in plain sight. The mothers who used Godfrey's cordial were not poisoning their children. They were managing an impossible situation with the tools the marketplace had provided. A baby that would not stop crying in a tenement with walls thin enough to transmit every sound to every neighbor was a baby whose noise generated complaints, generated conflicts, generated the specific social pressure that a family already living at the margin of tolerable existence could not afford to absorb. The cordial stopped the crying. It stopped it because it drugged the baby into silence, and the silence was the product the mother was purchasing, and the cost of the silence was measured in doses of opium administered to an infant whose body had no capacity to process what was being introduced into it. She knew, or she suspected, or she chose not to examine too carefully what the cordial contained because examining it would have required her to confront a choice she had already made, and the choice had been made not from ignorance but from the specific arithmetic of a life in which the baby's crying and the neighbor's anger and the factory shift she could not miss and the wages she could not lose were all variables in a calculation that the cordial resolved and that nothing else available to her could. The system that judged her for using it was the same system that had created the conditions that made it necessary. The judgment was always hers to carry. The conditions were never hers to change. The third calculation was the doctor. A doctor's visit cost money that a family earning 15 shillings a week in a good week and nothing in a bad one did not have. The baby's cough that had started on Sunday was worse by Wednesday. By Friday it had developed into something that the mother recognized because she had heard it before, in the neighbor's children, in the babies who had been coughing in the tenement below, in the specific sound that whooping cough or bronchitis or croup made in a small body in a cold room in a building where infection passed from family to family through the shared air of stairwells and landings and the thin walls that separated one household's illness from the next household's health by a distance measured in inches of lath and plaster. She could send for the doctor. The doctor would come, if he would come, and he would examine the baby, and he would prescribe something, and the prescription would cost money, and the doctor's visit would cost money, and the money spent on the doctor and the prescription was money not spent on coal or bread or rent, and rent that was not paid generated consequences that arrived faster and with more finality than almost any illness the doctor might have treated. Eviction from a tenement was not a process that accommodated appeals or extensions or the specific circumstance of a baby who was sick and a mother who had spent the rent on a physician. Eviction was a door that closed, and behind it was the street, and behind the street was the workhouse, and the workhouse infant mortality rate in some London unions approached 80%. She did not send for the doctor. She did what mothers in her position did, which was everything she could think of with everything she had. She kept the baby warm, or as warm as the room allowed. She fed it when it would eat. She held it when it cried. She sat up through the night in a chair beside the fire, if there was fire, holding the baby upright because upright seemed to ease the breathing, and she listened to the sound of the cough changing through the hours, and she calculated, in the arithmetic that mothers perform without numbers, whether the cough was getting better or getting worse, and she knew the answer before she finished the calculation, and she held the baby closer, and the night continued. Most of what you have just heard was documented in the parish records, the medical officers of health reports, and the Registrar General's annual returns. These women's losses were counted. Their grief was not. If you believe they deserve to be remembered for what they endured, and not just for the numbers they contributed to, drop a comment. Tell me what part of this you did not know. Dreadful History Files exists because you keep showing up for the stories that the official record reduced to statistics. The fourth calculation was the one she could not make, because it was the one the arithmetic refused to resolve. Which child gets the thickest blanket? Which child sleeps nearest the fire? Which child eats first when there is not enough for all of them to eat? The mathematics of scarcity inside a family with 3 children and a baby, and not enough of anything, required a distribution of insufficient resources across multiple people, whose needs were all urgent, and whose claims were all equal, and the distribution was the mother's to make. And making it required her to perform a kind of triage that the word triage does not adequately describe, because triage implies a medical professional making clinical decisions, and what she was doing was a mother in a cold room deciding which of her children would be warmest tonight, and knowing that the answer meant the others would be colder. The baby got priority. Babies always got priority, because babies died fastest. The infant mortality rate in London's poorest districts in the 1870s and 1880s ran at approximately 150 deaths per 1,000 live births. In some parishes it was higher. In some years it was considerably higher. Ansell's research, published in the 1870s, established that among the wealthy classes, the infant death rate was approximately 80 per 1,000. Among the general population, it was 150. The gap between those two figures was not a gap in biology. It was a gap in resources. The babies who died in Whitechapel and the babies who survived in Belgravia were the same species. They required the same things: warmth, milk, clean air, adequate nutrition, protection from infection. One set of babies received those things because their families could afford them. The other set did not, because theirs could not. The arithmetic was not complicated. The consequences were. She lost children. This is the part of the story that the historical record preserves most poorly, because the historical record was not designed to preserve grief. It was designed to preserve numbers, and the numbers are there, in the Registrar General's reports. and the parish burial registers, and the medical officers of health returns. And the numbers tell you that a working-class mother in the East End in the 1870s, who bore 6 children, could expect to bury at least one before it reached its first birthday, and possibly 2. The numbers tell you that. They do not tell you what it sounded like when the coughing stopped. They do not tell you what the room felt like the morning after. They do not tell you what she did with the shawl. The burial cost money. A pauper's funeral, the cheapest available, cost between 7 and 15 shillings, which was between a third and the entirety of a week's wages. Some families could not pay it. Burial clubs, which were informal saving schemes into which families paid a penny or 2 pence a week against the eventual cost of a funeral, existed precisely because the alternative, a parish burial in an unmarked grave, carried a social shame that even the poorest families wished to avoid. The burial club payment was another line in the arithmetic, another fraction of a penny extracted from a budget that had no fractions to spare, paid every week against the possibility that this week the payment would be needed. She went back to work. There was no alternative. There was no maternity leave, no bereavement leave, no social provision that acknowledged what she had lost or gave her time to carry it. The factory shift resumed. The piecework resumed. The tenement needed rent, and the children needed food, and the coal needed replacing, and the arithmetic did not pause for her grief any more than the winter paused for her children. She was pregnant again within the year. The cycle resumed. The arithmetic recalculated itself around a new set of variables that included 1 fewer child and 1 more pregnancy, and the same wages, and the same coal prices, and the same thin walls, and the same single-glazed window, and the same question every morning before the children woke. What can I afford today? What will I have to do without? What happens if I get this wrong? The system that surrounded her had an opinion about her. It had many opinions, expressed through the newspapers and the charity reports and the parliamentary debates about the deserving and undeserving poor, and the opinions ran a spectrum from pity to contempt, and the contempt was always closer to the surface than the pity, and the contempt said that poverty was a failure of character, and that the children who died in these tenements died because their mothers were ignorant, or careless, or drunk, or insufficiently committed to the domestic standards that the middle class maintained, and that the poor should aspire to, despite the fact that the domestic standards in question required resources that the wages available to working-class women made structurally impossible to obtain. Anthony S. Wohl, in Endangered Lives, his study of public health in Victorian Britain, documented the conditions with a thoroughness that the political establishment of the era never matched. The death rate in the poorest districts was not a mystery. It was a measurement. It was taken every year. It was published. It was known. And the gap between the death rate in Belgravia and the death rate in Bethnal Green was published alongside it. And the gap was enormous. And the gap persisted. And the system that published the gap did not close it, because closing it would have required spending money on the people at the bottom of the gap, and the people at the top of the gap, who were also the people who controlled the expenditure, had not been persuaded that the expenditure was justified. She did not need the Registrar General's report to tell her what was happening. She knew what was happening because it was happening in her room, to her children, on her body, with her hands. She knew the cost of coal and the cost of bread and the weight of a baby who was not gaining weight, and the sound of a cough that was getting worse, and the silence that followed the cough when the cough stopped for the wrong reason. She knew all of this with a precision that no report could match, because the report measured the population, and she measured her child, and her child was not a data point. Her child was the warmth against her chest at 3 in the morning, in a room where the fire had gone out, and the window would not seal, and the night was longer than any night had a right to be. The women who kept their babies alive through a Victorian winter did not do it with resources. They did it with everything resources are supposed to replace, with their own body heat, with their own milk, with shawls wrapped and rewrapped until the wrapping was all that was left, with nights spent upright in a chair because lying down made the baby's breathing worse, with pap that they knew was inadequate and cordial they suspected was dangerous, and prayers they were not certain anyone was hearing. They did it with love measured in pennies and distributed in fractions across children whose needs exceeded what the fractions could cover. And they did it every day, every winter, every year, with the arithmetic recalculating itself every morning, and the margin shrinking every time the coal ran out, or the rent came due, or the cough came back. Some of the babies survived. The ones who survived grew up in the same tenements and faced the same arithmetic and had their own children and performed the same calculations in the same cold rooms with the same insufficient answers. The cycle repeated because the conditions that produced it repeated, and the conditions repeated because the system that generated them had decided, with the confidence of a political establishment that did not live in tenements and did not lose children to winters it could have heated and did not perform arithmetic it could have resolved, that the cost of prevention was higher than the cost of loss, and that the loss was acceptable because the people experiencing it were not the people making the calculation. The mothers knew better. The mothers always knew better. The mothers knew that no loss was acceptable because no calculation exists that makes the death of a child a tolerable line item in someone else's budget. They knew it in the way that people know things that have never been validated by the institutions that claim authority over knowledge, which is to say, they knew it in their bodies and their grief, and the specific weight of a shawl that is no longer wrapped around anything. The parish registers hold the names, some of them. The smallest graves in the churchyards hold the rest, and the unmarked graves hold the ones whose families could not afford even the smallest marker. And the records of the burial clubs hold the penny-a-week payments that working-class mothers made against the possibility that this winter would be the one that took what the last winter had spared. They loved their children. The system that surrounded them did not make it easy to love their children, and it did not make it possible to keep all of them alive, and it did not acknowledge that the arithmetic it had created was an arithmetic of death disguised as an arithmetic of economy. And the women who performed that arithmetic every morning before the children woke performed it with a competence and a courage and a ferocity of devotion that the political class of Victorian England never recognized and never compensated and never came close to deserving. They deserved coal they could afford. They deserved wages that covered food and rent and heat in the same week without requiring them to choose. They deserved a doctor who came when the baby coughed and did not charge what the baby's funeral would cost. They deserved milk that was milk and bread that was bread, and a room warm enough that a child could sleep through a January night without its mother's body as the only source of heat in the building. They did not get any of those things. They got the arithmetic. And they did the arithmetic every morning with the accuracy of women whose children's lives depended on getting it right. And they got it right as often as the numbers allowed. And when the numbers did not allow, they held what they could not save and carried what they could not put down, and went back to work the next morning because the other children needed her, and the rent was due, and the coal was gone, and the arithmetic started again. Subscribe to Dreadful History Files. The past was not what they told you it was, and the next story is already waiting in a room that was colder than you can imagine and quieter than it should have been.